Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ruy Lopez, which begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez, and we're going to be taking a look at something called the Modern Steinitz variation, which begins with the move pawn to a6, bishop to a4, pawn to d6. If you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click your notification icon. So the Modern Steinitz variation, which looks exactly like the old Steinitz variation, includes the move pawn to a6, and that's basically the only difference. Now, that being said, that only difference is a big difference. It means that black can counter a thrust in the middle. Like, for example, if we were to play in the middle right away with d4, black can counter this with an immediate pawn to b5, and then after bishop b3, he can actually take in the center of the board, and this is considered acceptable. And because of this additional option that black has in meeting the move pawn to d4, it actually makes the Steinitz variation, this version of it, sort of more dangerous than the old Steinitz variation where we could just sort of play in the middle of the board with d4 with impunity, and it wasn't really possible to counter our thrust in the middle of the board or prevent us from getting more space. Now, that being said, d4 is of course still a very reasonable move. We can play d4. After b5, we can sort of play this like a sacrifice. We can play bishop to b3. They can take, and then we can continue with a sacrificial continuation. We can play pawn to c3. Now, it's interesting to note that it's not entirely clear if c3 is the best move here. I have tons of examples of people playing c3. The computer seems to think that it's okay to sacrifice this pawn. It also thinks it's okay to take the pawn. It thinks it's okay to play d captures c3, and then after knight to c3, just develop with a move like knight f6. Now, I will give one line here, because this is just the computer line. It is possible for white to play e5, takes on e5, bishop takes f7, king to e7, because of course we can't play king takes bishop because we hang our queen. And now the best theoretical move according to the computer is this move bishop to d5. Now, I have a game here where somebody played queen b3, and it's apparently major advantage black after c5, which is just threatening to cut off the queen's communication with the bishop. So what you're supposed to play is bishop to d5, and then according to the engine, best play is knight d5, king e6, knight f4 check, which seemingly wins the queen on d8. However, after takes, they can play bishop b4 check, and this theme actually happens in, I think, the Danish opening as well, where you have to retreat the queen, because of course the queen is attacked with this rook via discovery. You have to retreat the queen, and then you get your piece back. But now here, another desperado combination. They play f3, and then you take. And so now this is kind of a goofy position. The material is the same, but according to the engine, after bishop b7, rook g1, this position is completely equal. So c3, just based off of that line, which is very forcing, maybe we need to find an improvement to c3, because at the very least black has total equality. So there's these two other possibilities. There's of course bishop to d5, which is possible. I have this game Bashir-Lagrave versus Mamanjarov that was played in Riyadh back in 2017. That game continued rook to b8, queen d4, and queen d4 is interchangeable with bishop c6 apparently. Knight f6, bishop c6 check, bishop d7, queen d7. Castles should have been slight edge white, but white wasn't able to prove anything in this particular game. But he tried, he just didn't break through. So this game ended in a draw. That was Bashir-Lagrave versus Mamanjarov. So bishop d5 is worth a shot. Another thing that's worth a shot is maybe a4, just because the engine said so. The engine says that a4 is apparently very, very slight edge white. So a4 is something worth exploring, although I don't really have a whole lot of examples of this move from any strong players. So we'll just have to experiment with that on our own, I guess. But all this being said, it seems very reasonable that instead of d4, we can try something else. And that's why there's so many other main lines in this position. Castle's kingside is, of course, very playable. This dates all the way back to Steinitz. This was what some of the first practitioners played when they were faced with the modern Steinitz variation as they castled. So we've got games dating back to like 1895, Walbert versus Steinitz, played in Hastings in 1895. But that game actually went well for Steinitz. Again, not because this variation is all that great. Actually, in that game, Steinitz continued with knight f6, and then we have c3, bishop d7, pawn to d4, bishop e7, rook e1, and actually white should just have a major advantage here. And just to give you an idea about like kind of what I think about, you know, the era of Steinitz or whatever you want to call it. Steinitz just didn't have to put up with really good opposition. White has an advantage here. According to the computer, it's actually major advantage white. The game continued castles, knight on b2, rook e8, knight f1, e takes d4. And white just has a major advantage if he just keeps the pawn duo in the middle and just plays c captures d4. And white played knight captures d4. And I just don't know what to say. Like, when your opponents aren't even following just the most basic, positional principles of, recapturing with a pawn, recapturing towards the middle, getting 2 pawns in the middle of the board. It's difficult for me to comment on this, other than I guess you can play anything with black and win against this type of opposition, unfortunately. So knight takes d4 was played in that game, and eventually Steinitz got an advantage and Steinitz won. But of course we have an example just a few years later. We have Janowski versus Schlechter, played in Carlsbad in 1902, which continued with the correct move. C captures d4, and then we had d5 in that game, and then we had e5, and then knight e4, and then bishop to c2, knight to b4, bishop b1, c5, a3, knight c6, dc5, bishop to g4, pawn to b4, g6, bishop b2 was decisive advantage white. And of course, that is obviously the path that we should be going down. But castles in conjunction with this pawn to c3 idea is very good, and of course, by just association, just pawn to c3 is also a very good idea. And we have a lot of modern examples of pawn to c3 as well. So pawn to c3 is, of course, perfectly playable. I have some games that have kind of gone down this path between Magnus Carlsen and Nakamura have gone down this path. Now, other than pawn to c3, pawn to d4, and castles, there is one more option that's available. And it's kind of one of my favorite options. But basically the idea is that at some point we can play the move pawn to c4. Now, it is interesting to note when exactly we might want to play this. For example, you can play it in the castles line. Like, you can castle, and then after, say, bishop d7, you could play pawn to c4 right here. And so we have, Magnus Carlsen versus Nakamura again. This was played on chess.com back in 2023. That game continued g6, bishop c6, and then pawn to d4. So this is kind of the idea. We're getting this big center without a whole lot of downsides, apparently, and we're preventing black from ever breaking in the middle with the move pawn to d5. So this main idea of pawn to c4, whether it takes place in the castles line where you play c4, or whether it takes place in other lines. Now, my personal preference, I guess you could call it, in the handful of times that I faced this position, was to, instead of castle kingside, was to play the move pawn to d4 here, and then against bishop to d7, basically try to play c4 here. And I did a couple different versions of this, actually. But most notably, I had a game that I played against Victor Adler. This was all the way back in, I want to say, the St. Paul Winter Open back in 2003. And I do apologize if I get this game citation wrong. I played this game over 20 years ago now, 21 years ago. At the time, it was a huge victory for me. I was not even a master yet. I actually think I lipped over the master rating just after this tournament. And I had to beat Victor Adler, who he was at like his peak or near his peak. In terms of his ability. And he was an international master and the highest rated player in Minnesota at the time, back in 2003. And I had to beat him to win the tournament. And I had the white pieces, and I had looked at his games. On a database. Back then we had rudimentary databases, and not everybody had them. But I looked at his games on a database. I think I had to borrow the database, actually. And I discovered that he had lost a lot of games in this exact line. So I went ahead and I played it against him. And sure enough, he ended up eating up the clock, and I ended up winning the game. But that game actually continued e4, knight d4, bishop d7, and I played c4, which he really wasn't expecting. He wasn't expecting c4 in this particular move order. But it's still possible, and it still has a lot of the same ideas. And that game continued knight f6, knight c3, g6, and then I played bishop g5. already, like, the computer says this is slight edge white. He went into a long think, and after his next move, bishop e7, the computer says the position is major advantage white. Now, that being said, I'm not going to lie. I was rated like 2100 something at the time. He was rated 2550. I do have a slight edge in this position, somewhere between slight edge to major advantage, but there were a lot of adventures in this game. The main reason that I won the game was he ended up eating up a lot of clock time trying to come up with a decent plan. The plan that he did come up with eventually involved the sacrifice of a pawn on the queen side, and then after I'd castled kingside and played h3, he sacrificed for a kingside attack. And I managed to survive it, and I got to an endgame where he was actually better. We actually got to a position where he had a better endgame, but he was in serious time trouble, and he dropped a whole rook in that endgame, and I managed to win the game. So it was a cool win, and I don't think I did anything particularly wrong in the opening phase of the game either. And it did make me kind of like this idea of playing pawn to c4. But of course, I'm not the only person that likes this concept of playing pawn to c4. Again, it's a very common thing to play. And just as a recommendation, I think if you are going to play it, I would go more down the path of the way that, you know, Nakamura and the way that Magnus Carlsen is playing this with the white pieces, where he's castling first, and then after something like bishop d7, now you play something like c4. And like I said, I like this path. I like this Carlsen versus Nakamura played on chess.com back in 2023. I think this is a very reasonable path. Again, this continued g6, bishop c6, d4, bishop g7, knight c3, knight to e7, bishop to e3, and of course, white has some sort of slight advantage here. You can actually reach positions very similar to this out of a King's Indian. And the ideas and the plans are very similar to a King's Indian, sort of a classical King's Indian. But as in the King's Indian, where white has an advantage, also here, white has some sort of advantage. And that's basically the idea of playing this move pawn to c4, is you're turning this into something more like a King's Indian. And you're trying to prove that it's easier to make your queenside play and your center play happen in these positions because you're going to be gaining tempos against this misplaced bishop. And you're going to be gaining tempos as you make your advances on the queen side with moves like b4 and c5, for example. So anyways, that's how you get sort of a slight edge against the, I would guess you'd call it the modern Steinitz. My main recommendation is pawn to c4, but that doesn't leave out the possibility of playing the other lines mentioned in this video. I think it is possible to play castles followed by c3 or c4, and of course I think it's also possible to play c3 here. One final side note, I think it's reasonable if you just want something really simple that has almost no theory on it. It's reasonable to just play delayed exchange, to just exchange, and play d4, and then after e takes d4, play queen takes d4. And you just should have some sort of advantage here. I do have an example of this with queen takes d4. I also have an example with knight takes d4 with UAE versus Mamanjarov, played back in 2017, where white went on to win as well. So either queen d4 or knight d4 are both possible ideas, and these are a lot less explored. So you can probably just have a slight advantage there. So those are all your options against the old Steinitz variation. I mean, against the modern Steinitz variation to get some sort of advantage with the white pieces. The only thing I would sort of recommend against, and it's a little painful to say so, is the immediate pawn to d4. You know, because it's painful to say this because this was the move that I played against Victor Adler and won with. Yay. But I sort of recommend against it just because I think it's reasonable to do this. I think it's reasonable to play b5, and I think it's reasonable to take. And I'm not 100% sure that a4, bishop d5, or c3 yield any kind of advantage for white. I will note that I did have this prepped for my game against Adler, and I intended pawn to c3 in that game. And Adler avoided it, probably not wanting to give me a position that aggressive, you know, against a lower rated opposition who was kind of known to be, you know, somewhat tactically dangerous. But if I were to play this today, I would avoid this move order. I would just go ahead and castle or even play c4 right away here, would be my preference. But basically just trying to get to that exact same type of pawn structure that I got to in my game against Adler, but from a move order that's a little bit safer. Anyways, I hope you found this content useful. I hope you found these ideas helpful, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.